Hey there, folks. So, I said that I was going to be doing a Metroid retrospective next, covering the 4 2D games leading into Metroid Dread. But, that's still a month away, and there is technically another 2D Metroid game, Metroid Other M. At the time of its development, it was conceived as a new 2D/3D entry in the series set between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. So I decided that this month I will cover that game. Against my better judgment. Yeah, let's get this out of the way. I'm not super excited about it, but I thought it would be a fun way to kind of kick off this Metroid retrospective with this pretrospective, I like that, into the series by analyzing this game and what it does wrong as far as Metroid is concerned, and use that as kind of like a game design bible to go over what the actual games do right in the retrospective that I will be doing next month to lead into my Metroid Dread review in October. So, that being said, I guess let's just jump right into this. Oh boy. Alright, I want to start off by saying that I don't really make a habit of, ripping apart games. There's really only, one main video I can think of before that I kind of, took a very negative stance on a game that I was covering for a video. And I had a lot of fun with that, I'll be honest. But I try to stay fairly positive and, find the good within the bad as well. So I plan to do that with this game, too. It's not a total trash fire, but this game does do a lot of things wrong. So I have to still, make that clear while also diving into all aspects of it from a game design standpoint. That being said, I mentioned already, this game gets a lot of things wrong. There are occasionally neat puzzle rooms that get close to implementing clever ideas, and on rare occasions it manages some solid justification for the ability to switch into first person for aiming, but it lacks so much overall vision that any good ideas are overshadowed by the bad. For example, because you can go into first person at any time, every room feels super bland in order to make that 2D to 3D structure work on the limited Wii hardware. There's rarely anything interesting to even look at in first person, and conversely, there's few rooms that justify the 3D movement enough for how often this game just throws either long empty hallways at you or huge open landscapes with nothing in them. Where the 2D games have more interesting vertical level design or dense horizontal corridors full of hidden power-ups and bombable blocks and hard-to-avoid enemies, Other M has clearly visible power-ups that are barely off the main path, and a few scattered enemies that can easily be walked past or killed as you go thanks to auto-aiming. Which auto-aiming itself is kind of a byproduct of being a 3D game that you can only control with the D-pad. Any sense of exploration and tension is lost just by the nature of the poor 3D level design. And these games are all about exploration, so that's a major misstep. The Prime games, even, were designed with 3D in mind. Sticking solely to first person allowed every landscape to be detailed and mapped out specifically for 3D platforming. Because Other M tries to find the blend of 2D and 3D, it doesn't do either one well. It also doesn't allow you to move while in first person, which limits possible 3D puzzle options to just searching for a thing to shoot and then switching back to third person. And the limited 3D movement in third person with arbitrary locked doors ushering you forward one way means any puzzle sections just involve the one clearly marked path that usually involves a linear morph ball trail to a terminal that unlocks a door. This repetition gets old very fast, and the generic hallways of easily dispatched enemies don't do much to break this up, even with the occasional puzzle room that's actually kind of clever. But emphasis on occasional. And even then, the perceived linearity still diminishes any satisfaction from progressing, because you know exactly where to go next, and the slow trickle of Adam authorizing power-ups, which is a problem itself I will get to as we go, means your already limited traversal options are even more limited by a pretty generic moveset for the first few hours. After the early authorization of bombs and missiles, I think the only other power-up you get in the whole of Sector 1 is the diffusion beam. And as satisfying as that is to shoot, it doesn't factor into progression at all. It just trivializes combat even more, because it's this big scatter shot that basically kills everything on screen. One major section early on that I think sums up how misguided this is toward the end of Sector 1. The whole area was fine, not great. But then you reach a wide open and stupidly empty plains area. The game just basically forces you forward at a snail's pace with nothing to fight, nothing really to see, and any semblance of alternate paths stripped away by just dead-end hallways ushering you one way. You reach the control room with other Federation troops and have to deal with some hokey exposition dialogue that means nothing, and then continue walking slowly forward with terrible tank controls through more generic hallways that I think are supposed to be atmospheric, but there's nothing atmospheric to see, and you can't even, use your weapon or anything, so you're just walking. I mean, if there's one thing we all equate the Metroid series with, it's slow walking. Yeah. The worst part about this game is how it gates you off almost every step of the way, basically forcing you to stop at every save station to open the arbitrarily locked door in front of you, and most rooms that seem to have alternate path puzzles in them for optional pickups are actually just the only way forward, and they just happen to have an item pickup you literally can't miss. But at least that still kind of feels like traditional Metroid exploration. This area basically strips all pretense of exploration out, and just literally has you walk forward slowly with a zoomed-in, over-the-shoulder view, and that should mean that there's some visually interesting environmental storytelling, or at least some tension to build. But no, it just becomes a tedious walking simulator through multiple rooms. Anyway, after all that, you reach a room full of doors, and have to walk up to each one until you trigger a cutscene. And then deal with a forced first-person section where I knew exactly what to scan, but still couldn't get it to trigger because of how small the target was. That's what this was building toward? And even worse, after that it jumps you back to the control room for another unnecessary cutscene, and then you just have to tank walk that same path again, back to the room you were just in. Except now, it triggers a different cutscene where space pirates attack. For reasons. The other troopers piss off behind a locked door and leave Samus to take them on herself, and this fight just made me realize how insignificant the combat system is when translated to a 3D space. In past Metroid games, space pirates were a terrifying threat that would jump around and shoot beams across the screen, leaving you only able to dodge or duck or jump to get past them. This game trivializes all of that, because the same buttons that move Samus also activate her dodge mechanic. So you just kind of naturally dart out of the way of most attacks accidentally, and her gun auto-aims. As much as I genuinely enjoy the spectacle of combat in this game, combining the widespread of the diffusion beam with the nicely animated finishing moves, it's just not actually that fun to participate in fights because of how automatic it all feels. If you just kind of wiggle side to side and then release a charged diffusion beam, enemies will just die with minimal effort. And since the dodge mechanic auto-charges your gun, and finishing moves auto-trigger when you get near an enemy with a fully charged shot, I found a lot of this fight specifically almost playing itself. It's the same problem I have with Mega Man X7. I mean, I have a lot of problems with that game, don't get me wrong, but the shift to 3D made it stupidly easy to avoid most enemies, and this game makes that problem even worse because of how powerful and spread out the diffusion beam is. So, basically, this whole section is either boring tank control walking, or combat that mostly plays itself. Sums up a majority of this game, honestly. Oh, but we're not done yet. After the fight, you just go backwards through those same rooms again to trigger another cutscene where a gross pubescent Ridley attacks. Yeah, spoilers if you didn't know that's what that thing was, I guess. Anyway, there's a fight in a forced first-person perspective that's more just tedious and annoying than anything, as you try to get the finicky missile lock-on to target his tail over and over while he just looms over you with this stupid face slobbering. After an arbitrary number of shots, it switches back to a cutscene to finish the fight, as Samus has to be saved by the generic Federation troopers that I guess have access to the plasma beam, even though she also has it and just can't use it right now. Because this game doesn't understand how badass she's supposed to be and can't let a girl save the day herself. Apparently. And then the troopers piss off again and tell Samus to go follow the thing into Sector 3, neglecting to mention that it's friggin' hot down there and she might want to get permission to use her life-saving Varia suit. But that probably won't be important. Also, do you say Varia or Varia? Let me know in the comments. I've always said Varia, clearly. But anyway, speaking of Sector 3, the Federation forces Samus into the lava sector next, and she runs through various rooms hot enough to burn through her environmental protection suit, and not once does she think, "This sucks. I should just activate my Varia suit because I'm a strong, independent bounty hunter who don't need no man." This culminates in a fight against a big lava creature where Adam is finally like, "Fine. If you're gonna keep whining about burning alive, I guess you can activate your Varia suit." And then she kills the boss easily because her visor isn't steamed up anymore from her burning flesh. This area is also painfully linear and mostly forgettable. Like, seriously, as I write this, I played it earlier today, and the only thing I remember is running through hot sections and that volcano boss fight. Basically, after that you reach another arbitrary progress block room where you note that the grapple beam is required, and Adam is like, "Nah, just backtrack and head to the ice sector. Oh, and here's the ice beam. I bet it'll be super useful down there where everything is already frozen. Okay, bye!" Oh, speaking of ice, go make yourself a cold drink and take a sip every time I say arbitrary. It's gonna happen a lot. Anyway, the main problem with this backtrack is you've barely gotten anything new and nothing needed for the items here. So it's not even like a normal Metroid backtrack where you can just go back through rooms again and show how strong you got by collecting items you couldn't reach before. It's just running through the same hallways again, avoiding the same boring enemies. Except now you're not dying the whole time. The ice beam isn't even used for puzzles in this game. It just makes it easier to get that cool finishing move on enemies, because it, stops them in their tracks. Anyway, on to Sector 2, I guess. This area is a bit more memorable, because there's actually some interesting biomes and clever platforming, thanks to manipulating ice platforms and changing the environment to access new areas of old rooms. But it's still more of the same. Winding hallways, and occasional large but empty plains. You do actually get some great items here though, or I should say you were authorized to use some great items here, including the wave beam and the only example of the speed booster being used in a 3D Metroid game. And you know what? The speed booster is actually a lot of fun, especially with how smoothly it integrates the Shine Spark in as an actual function, rather than being mostly optional for pros to be able to get 100% item collection. as well as like sequence break the game and stuff like that. I was never that good at that stuff. So launching high into the air in this game is actually pretty satisfying to pull off. But anyway, we're not quite there yet. I still have a few distinct complaints about this part, even though I liked it. The main thing I want to explain here is a perfect example of why Adam's power authorization woefully misunderstands how Metroid works. So normally, Metroid games are still fairly linear, even if it might not be as obvious because you're only going one map tile at a time, rather than seeing a bunch of corridors lined up in front of you. But the enjoyment of exploration in those games comes from finding things off the beaten path. Or, more often than not, discovering that you were actually headed in the right direction all along as you enter a room with the next important power-up you need to progress further. Another Rim is actually structured very similar to that, but that's what makes it so wrong. Let me share my example. There's a point in Sector 2 where you reach another kind of industrial complex building, but slightly iced over this time. Ooh. And there are 2 doors. One to Samus's left, and one in front. I immediately went left because it seemed like a side path. There was an open plain and an actually pretty cool Shine Spark section leading to a Morph Ball puzzle that finally dropped down into an enclosed room with just an energy tank in it and a charge beam switch behind glass. I knew I needed to reach it, but I didn't know how. Typical Metroid formula, you'd find the wave beam somewhere nearby and then come back to open up progress. So I leave. Energy tank was still a great reward for that detour, and I go back to the main room, where a cutscene activates and space pirates drop in to start pelting Samus through glass walls that just arbitrarily surrounded her. I waited way too long for finally the wave beam to be activated and then Samus can fight back through the glass. Okay, got the wave beam. Dope. Well, I already had the wave beam, but you know what I mean. Go back through that same section I just did again, and back to the same room, just to shoot a charged beam through the glass, which apparently activates an elevator in the other direction I didn't go yet. So I never would have made progress, basically, because I had to trigger that cutscene fight for wave beam to be activated. It all felt so unnecessary, like the game was punishing me for exploring, because I was never going to find some awesome new item or anything. I just needed to fulfill the cutscene conditions and go back. And what's crazy is this section specifically wouldn't need to be that different in a traditional Metroid formula. See, in that Morph Ball puzzle, there were a few other paths to drop down that would just dump you back into the snow below. But it's obvious they're just holes, so you know to pass them up. But a better, more traditional Metroid game could have had those holes also lead down tubes. Maybe one still drops you below, but you don't know right away because the tube takes you down, and then another takes you to the wave beam. Progress is still gated off, but you figure out the solution through progression rather than an arbitrary story beat. And then, if you get the wave beam before you end up in that room, you can just shoot the charge beam switch and move on. But if you don't, you know that you can't progress, go back up to the Morph Ball puzzle, and take another path. This cuts down on tedious backtracking and handholding. It's like this game is actively allergic to any kind of sequence breaking, though, thanks to all items being handed to you through plot devices, and most doors randomly locked until you stop at a save station. For example, in the modded version I was playing, it's even possible to use super missiles before you get them, but only in third person, so not every super missile door can be opened early. And there wasn't a single instance of that giving me access to something out of order. It would just lead to a tiny side room with a missile tank, usually. And this one example of how you receive the wave beam perfectly sums up how this game feels about the player. You are just a passive participant in the linear narrative that takes place across this hallway simulator. This isn't a game that rewards meticulous exploration or sequence-breaking tricks. Hell, you can't even wall jump most places. It only works on the pre-designated kick climb areas. Ugh, I hate that they call it kick climb. I hate this game. Why am I doing this with my life? I finally get Metroid Dread soon. Why did I think this was a good idea to torture myself with this garbage? Anyway, so I just realized at this point that I didn't actually explain the modded version I'm playing. So this is called the Maximum Edition. It's basically just some graphical changes, like cutting out a lot of the story bits that are just bad. I mean, granted, this whole story is bad, but, specifically the worst story bits. I think it, dropped the file size of the game by, half, which is kind of insane. It also allows you to shoot missiles in third person. You can also use concentration at any point, because this game doesn't give you life or missile pickups or anything. It's just the concentration ability that, refills your stuff. Which also means there's no reason to ever fight enemies, but that's beside the point. This lets you actually, do that concentration at any point instead of only when you're at, critical health. So it kind of fixes that system, but also makes the entire battle system super easy, but whatever. It made the game go by quicker. It's fine. The missile part is what actually kind of redeemed the game a little bit, because there's a lot of moments that are, unbearable when you have to go into the first person, but when you can shoot missiles in third person, and it does, the auto-aim lock-on, it's not nearly as bad. Still sucks, but not nearly as bad. In general, this mod made the game a lot more playable, at least. Just not, a better game, really. Oh, also, it allows me to map all of the Wiimote stuff to an Xbox controller, so I didn't have to actually, turn the Wiimote to go into first person. I could just, hit a trigger to switch that vision, and it made the first person view much easier to activate and use, because I just had to toggle it on and off by hitting a trigger. Again, doesn't fix the game, just fixes a lot of the bad control issues in the game. Alright, let's move on. This section also includes some pleasantly surprising story bits about the Federation soldiers seemingly picking each other off in secret, and the only one that saw it happen was the randomly introduced Madeline Bergman, who is almost as big of a meme as the baby, with how she comes out of nowhere and then dominates the story. There's also a decent fight against one of those things Sigourney Weaver uses on Aliens, but this part also makes me mad because it just arbitrarily blocks you off from going back after this fight, despite items back there to collect that I'd totally be able to reach by jumping and ledge grabbing. Stupid game. But at least this time there's a few collectibles to grab off the beaten path along the way, thanks to some light speed boost puzzles. So I actually got some brief enjoyment from backtracking and being able to get things I couldn't reach on the way in. Even if it's still dumb I couldn't just activate those powers I already had then. Full disclosure, the Maximum Edition mod I used kind of helped justify this by early on explaining that the Hyper Beam from the end of Super Metroid basically fried Samus's suit and its systems are slowly coming back online. So technically, in this playthrough, it's not Adam authorizing them for the most part, they just happen to come back online at those moments. Which helps to justify some things, like Samus being forced to basically run through lava in her underwear, but I'm playing this mod for my convenience, and the real game still justifies everything using Adam's authority, so that's the narrative we're sticking with. All that aside, you're next asked to go back to Sector 3, because apparently they didn't feel like making more than 3 places to explore, and you head to a new part of that sector you can reach now based on a desert biome. Nothing here is really that special, but there is another fight with the mystery creature that I thought seemed similar enough to the Ridley prototype, but apparently wasn't. Also, it's ugly and a real stupid design, but whatever. A lot of creatures in this game are bad 3D designs. Including Ridley, actually. But yeah, the desert is fairly short and inconsequential. There's kind of a dumb puzzle involving missiles and the grapple beam that isn't used anywhere else in the game, which I guess is a compliment, technically, because it sucks. And then you continue making the rounds back through the same sectors. This is normally when the more linear games would open up a lot more and finally let you go back through past areas to get missed collectibles and stuff. But not Other M, it's innovative. It doesn't do what all the other good games do. It keeps arbitrarily locking doors to funnel you where it wants you to go, even though you have everything you need to progress. But nope, optional power-ups will have to wait. Adam can't have you getting too strong and ignoring his commands, or something. So yeah, there's some vaguely interesting story concepts here about someone killing off the Federation troops, and Samus finds Anthony in Sector 3's core, or whatever, and they discover that he's found the next stage of the Ridley creature's evolution. Yeah, it's full-on Ridley now. But first, the whole thing comes to a halt as you search for the not-at-all obvious target the game wants you to find, which basically just shows a broken bridge and then Ridley attacks. It's real dumb. Then you get what should be a hype battle against Samus's longtime rival, but it's kinda not good. Like, I'll admit, I love Ridley. I even named my cat Ridley, but most Ridley fights just evolve into tanking the damage. But this one, being in a 3D arena, had the potential to be so much different, more akin to the multi-stage boss fights in the Prime games, but nah, it's kinda just still a bullet sponge as you dodge the tail. It plays it very safe, especially with how kind of anticlimactic this whole Ridley reveal is anyway. But oh well, what's done is done. Ridley escapes, badly wounded, and Samus realizes that if someone is killing the Federation troops, Adam is probably next, so she rushes off to save him. And gets diverted to Sector 1 again, where the traitor seems to be headed. After traversing back through the same few boring hallways that Sector 1 has, you discover the traitor. Kinda? You really just find Madeline again, and get a bunch more boring exposition, and then leave Sector 1. Yep, that was it. Oh, and on the way there, you authorize your own space jump and screw attack. Basically because Adam isn't there to say no, but on the way back out, you still can't access any side doors, so it's basically useless outside of just trivializing all combat from here on. Which is fine by me, because it's not like they give you health or missile pickups anyway, so there's no point in really fighting anything unless it's required for progress. That's actually a larger complaint in this section. Pacing. After a fairly boring first half as far as the trickle out of new powers, between this quick run of all three sectors, you basically unlock Plasma Beam, Super Missiles, Space Jump, and Screw Attack, all in what feels like just a few minutes. I know those are all fairly powerful moves, but I feel like gating all of these off was the only way they could keep the game so linear. And then after you get all those, they have to just lock doors to keep you focused on the story path forward, because otherwise you'd be able to get anywhere. Even though the story sucks, and I just want to collect all the little glowy dots because that's what I love about Metroid. You also get the only other new item in the game, Seeker Missiles, from a random easy fight as you leave Sector 1. This doesn't open up much more stuff, and frankly doesn't feel different enough from the Super Missile with how late you get both. But it's basically just used to lock an important door in Sector 2 that the game ushers you to next. And this almost made the rest of the game worth it. Almost. After a few more generic hallways, you notice a weird gravity effect and then get flipped onto the ceiling. It's probably the most fun the platforming has been here, and it gave me some serious Mario Galaxy vibes with how you had to navigate some tricky wall jumps and stuff while upside down. Then, gravity flips back but gets very heavy, so you can't speed boost and can barely space jump, so you have to rely on some heavy little hops and a few grapple beam points to get through before you reach a weirdly large and empty room. Par for the course at this point. Gravity returns to normal and you just make your way up to the exit doors when Nightmare breaks out of whatever gravity chamber it was in, I assume controlling the artificial gravity of the bottle ship, and attacks you. And it's a pretty dope fight. Sure, some of it is nostalgia talking, and it's nowhere near as hard as in Fusion, because the 3D space and auto-aim makes his weak point stupid easy to hit, but at least it's a pretty unique fight and battlefield, as well as a callback to my favorite Metroid game. After you beat him, you're able to continue on to Sector 0, where Madeline directed you to for some reason. I honestly wasn't really paying attention, and like I said, the Maximum Edition mod cuts out a lot of the cutscene stuff, so Probably lost the context anyway. Unfortunately, Sector 0 immediately wipes out all of the hype of the nightmare fight because it's just a few bland corridors, and then that cutscene. Yep, this is finally where that thing happens, where Samus becomes a weak little girl and Adam shoots her to sacrifice himself and save the day instead. It's so dumb. Honestly, I'm glad the cutscene was mostly chopped up in my version, even if it was still pretty dumb. After that, you have to escape the sector because Adam basically blew himself and the Metroids up, and the bottle ship jettisons that whole sector while Samus is still there weak. So, Samus panics and activates her gravity suit, which she had the whole time and didn't feel the need to turn on when gravity was wonky before Nightmare. She already knew Adam wasn't around and activated the screw attack without his permission. Why would she go through all of that unstable gravity and to fight against a creature that literally manipulates gravity around him and just figure, nah, I'm good. But anyway, the gravity suit in this game is super weird because it just activates a purple glow whenever it's active, but looks like the regular Vario suit any other time. Luckily, my mod actually gives her the iconic purple suit, and that made the end of the game a lot more satisfying. It's the little things, honestly. And speaking of the little things, oh snap, Nightmare isn't dead. The second fight is also really good, despite being immune to its gravity effects now. It has a few new little tricks, such as a little black hole that absorbs beams and missiles, so you can only hit Nightmare when it comes close to crawl at you. It's a great fight. The only bad part is... that baby cry. It gave me Resident Evil flashbacks, and oof, I did not need that in my life right now. But after the epic Nightmare fight, the game kind of rushes on to the end. You get a little time to clean up the rest of the items, but still can't access everywhere, and you also are still missing a key item for opening some doors, the power bomb. The item you were told to never use, despite a surprising number of doors on this ship that can only be opened with the power bomb. Weird. Why do they have those doors? But yeah, not much else to say going into the endgame, honestly. The rest of the game seriously sucks, and that's saying something since the rest of the game seriously sucked. The story goes off the rails and makes no sense, with the real Madeline Bergman being introduced and an exposition dump about how the other one is a cyborg clone of Mother Brain or something. It's real weird. And there's some stuff with Ridley shedding his form again, but you don't see him, just his husk. So I don't really know what that means, since his next appearance is... well, it was leading into his appearance in Fusion, and he's been frozen for a while in that game. And then you come across a room with hatched Metroid eggs, and the Metroid Queen, for some reason. No idea where she came from, or why, but I guess it's just an excuse for another nostalgia fight from Metroid 2. And this one kinda sucks. It's mostly just being overwhelmed by a bunch of Metroid babies. Like, seriously, it would have been impossible without the ability to shoot missiles in third person, because the only way you can hurt them is missiles once you've frozen them. And they only stay frozen for like 5 seconds, so it's insane. And then, after you take out all the Metroids, you have to shoot some weird crystal things on the Queen's neck, and then some basically quick time events of being forced into first person, and then swallowed alive, and you just... You die? It's a weird blink and you miss it climax to the battle, where your life is drained fast, and you're supposed to just figure out that you use a power bomb in her belly. There's no dialogue, no menu screen activating the ability. You just have to figure it out or die. But you'd think that's the final battle of the game, right? No. More weird pacing as you just walk through a few rooms, and then the fake cyborg Mother Brain clone Madeline Bergman character appears with some just awful cutscenes that don't make any sense, as she, like, summons a bunch of monsters into the room, I guess. This was like an hour-long cutscene that you can't skip, and I stopped paying attention. But then there's another forced first-person fight as they dart around the room, blocking your vision and attacking the remaining troopers, while Madeline Bergman just, like, sits there, like, controlling them all or something. It seems impossible to kill all of the creatures since you can't concentrate for more life and missiles, and you're stuck in first person, so you can't, like, dodge or anything. But you might just get lucky and notice that if you point your first-person cursor at just the right point, you can target Madeline Bergman, or fake Mother Brain, or whatever you want to call her. But yeah, as soon as you target her, it awkwardly cuts back to a cutscene as someone steals Samus's kill. She doesn't even get the final shot, and then it's happily ever after. The pacing of this story gave me whiplash, and I've played it before, so I can see why people just give up. It's trash. And this was even a moderately improved version of that story in this mod. It's sometimes hilarious for the same reason that, like, the Metal Gear Solid game lore is, but this takes itself way too seriously and leaves way too many loose threads out there for something that was supposed to canonically take place between Metroid 3 and 4. And speaking of loose ends, the game still technically isn't over yet. So after the janky ending cutscenes that don't even bother explaining how Anthony survived a drop into a lava pit, who the one murdering the other troopers was, why the Metroid Queen was just chilling in that room, or really anything else important, Samus mentions that they're going to destroy the bottle ship in a few days, and then she drops back into the bottle ship to say goodbye, I guess? The justification is flimsy at best, but finally, you get to freely explore the entire map with a fully kitted out Samus. And I'll be honest, aside from how boring most of these sectors are to explore, this part actually feels pretty good. It's maddening how late in the game it is before you can access a lot of these power-ups, but at least the game finally takes off the training wheels and just lets Samus do what she does best. Kinda. More on that in a second. They also finally let you have free access to power bombs. Even though in the beginning they seemed to imply that the bombs are so powerful that one could destroy the whole ship, but oh well, they still put powerbomb doors in this ship, so I guess they knew what they were doing. But yeah, technically, you are given free reign of the ship here. Except every area is still just a bunch of tedious corridors with really only one way around, so you're just wandering back through the same areas you've been through a dozen times, except now there's less locked doors. Though, still a few, annoyingly. In other Metroid games, your late-game backtracking would be sped up by how powerful Samus is. Things like screw attack blocks that give you access to shortcuts between areas, or powerbomb doors that connect back to other item-filled areas that connect back to where you were previously. But here, the map design is so sterile and linear that there's barely any difference exploring now than before. You can't even really navigate easier with the screw attack because it's mostly just horizontal movement, and there are some invisible walls that prevent you from deviating from the set path. So you still have to slow down and connect to grapple points, or make use of the Shine Spark. And yes, there are powerbomb doors you can open now, but oof. I wonder why most of these were even locked off. To start, they activate these frustrating and arbitrary combat encounters against those dome bug things that the Mother Brain clone used against you at the end of the main game. Except now you can actually kill them. They're not fun to fight, and can sometimes stun lock you before you can even get up and react to their attacks, so you basically either have a fairly easy time dodging and shooting them to death, or you get stun locked to death. No in between. And every powerbomb door has one of these fights. which means there should be some nice late game goodies behind them, right? Maybe some, pathways to connect the sectors together and give you cool shortcuts with powerful items. Nope. Most of them are just normal little item alcove with the same missile, energy, or Excel charge expansions like the ones littering the rest of the map that doesn't need the power bomb to access. It's dumb. And these doors are fairly random, to where you go all the way through an area with no other item pickups, just to reach a power bomb door at a dead end and find a tiny room with a missile in it. Then you have to backtrack again to leave the area. If these were actual connecting corridors that facilitated your path from area to area, tying up loose ends, I'd totally understand them being locked until post-game. But no, you still just loop around the sector, go back up the elevator, and then down to the next sector and do it again. It's tedious and boring. And some of the regular power-ups I missed ranged from frustratingly obtuse, like one that requires you to lock onto a super missile door on the ceiling while sliding down a hill in first person, and then run back up the hill to then slide down again and lock on again in first person to a grapple point that appears after you've managed to fight those controls enough. And then there's the just impossible to notice items. Like one that I didn't even know until I got the item ping on the map, because it was off screen thanks to the fixed camera angle, and you can only reach it by space jumping from across the room toward the camera into a hidden alcove on the other side of the room. There's occasionally clever ones, usually involving a mix of shine spark for height and space jump for distance, that hint at this game actually having some good ideas. But even those control kind of awkwardly because of just navigating the space jump in a 3D space that you don't have camera control in. And did I mention that some areas have random invisible walls that prevent you from freely exploring? I hate invisible walls. I spent so long finding my way around the lava pit in Sector 3 because there are 3 separate paths around it and you can't just space jump between them, despite it being an open area. You have to find the grapple points that connect the lanes to each other and then search the 3D space for what triggers the item collection. One specifically that requires going into first person for an off-camera charge shot switch was especially maddening. These aren't tricky puzzle sections that require skill. They're just exercises in frustration, exploring a map that isn't even detailed enough to lead your way. Like, your mini-map and your actual map don't match up, even though both are 2D, unlike the Prime games that gives you full 3D display of each room. This game tries to be both 2D and 3D at the same time, and manages to fail at both. But anyway, even after scouring the boring map for all the leftover items, the game isn't quite over yet either. Hidden among the many new paths you can find with your full arsenal is a secret post-game boss, which I actually didn't even know about in my first playthrough. And that sucks because it was a hoot to finally experience. Continuing the trend of adapting 2D bosses in this game, Fan Toon from Super Metroid makes an appearance, and it'll take Samus's full power to beat it this time. Again, the justification is non-existent. It seems like he's just floating out in space, but the fight itself is still great. It doesn't make playing the rest of the game worth it, but it's a very nice epilogue for fans. After the fight is over, I guess Fan Toon causes too much damage to the ship, and the self-destruct sequence gets activated. Samus, having literally let her guard down after finding Adam's old helmet, has to run back to her ship with 5 minutes on the clock. And without her power armor for some reason. She can deactivate it in a camera cut, but doesn't think, let's switch that back on real quick while this ship explodes. I might need the gravity protection if nothing else. Whatever, I guess they just wanted an excuse to force you into Zero Suit status for this final sequence. And it's fine. For some reason there's space pirates everywhere now, but they're pretty harmless due to how easy they are to avoid in 3D. But less easy to avoid are the bad 3D controls with a D-pad that feel even more imprecise here than ever, especially with how unforgiving some of the collision detection is and how little health Samus has. Yeah, it's dumb. But I got to the ship, passing up the one last missile expansion that would have given me 100% because I refused to let this be my first fully completed Metroid game, and let the ending play out. It's over. Good riddance. Like I said, the fight itself was a nice epilogue, and even the escape sequence felt like nostalgia pandering. But that's about the only thing this game does halfway decently anyway. Honestly, that's my main takeaway from this game. Everything new it does to try and evolve or reinvent the Metroid formula is terrible, and the story and exploration are absolute messes. But there's also an enjoyment behind the nostalgia this game provides by reimagining a lot of 2D staples in 3D for the first time. The classic bosses are well done, and the speed boost actually feels really good to use, even if sometimes it can get blocked by arbitrary collision detection, and it's not always clear how much space you need to activate it. The screw attack and space jump don't fare quite as well, but they function about the same as they did in the Prime games, which are still kind of imperfect. More for just infinite horizontal movement, rather than free movement everywhere, but it sometimes felt like I should be able to reach an area with it that was just blocked for no reason, so I'd have to use the grapple beam or something else instead, which takes away some of the power the screw attack should have. Missiles definitely make the worst transition to 3D, as they're context sensitive and first person, and you have to basically wait for the game to register that something needs to be hit with the super missile, for example, before you can actually charge your beam and make a super missile come out, which drastically slows down those first person sections during combat when you're already trying to dodge attacks and things like that. It's those kinds of concessions the game makes that just don't sit well, or age well. It's similar to how Super Metroid had you hitting select like 5 times to get to your grapple or X-ray visor. It's dated game design that was a product of its time and the controller, but Other M is only like 10 years old and really has no right to get away with that excuse, because they really could have fixed it by just giving you access to the Wiimote and Nunchuck. And then they could have mapped things in a way that felt way more satisfying. Hell, even how I had it set up on an Xbox controller worked better. And that's just fans figuring out how to do the best they can with the jank they were given. Nintendo has no excuse for such backwards control schemes. Except that it was the Wii, and really every game had weird controls on that system. I mean, look at how they managed to port Skyward Sword over to the Switch. That's still not perfect. The first-person stuff isn't even all that bad, as a concept. There's a world where that mix of perspectives could have worked, and it was infinitely more tolerable when I didn't have to go into first-person just to shoot missiles. But it feels like the whole game suffered by building environments for both first and third person, because the Wii just wasn't powerful enough to render diverse, detailed environments that look good in both 2D and 3D. I want to end this TED Talk by briefly discussing the overall game design, and why I judge this game harsher than, say, Metroid Fusion, which has similar linear structure and heavier emphasis on story, but it's my favorite, whereas this is just the worst. The main difference is on how that linearity is portrayed. For example, the lack of found power-ups. The only new items are the diffusion beam and the seeker missiles, and they're both obtained from enemies. This trivializes most of the exploration in the game because you were literally just wandering from one area to the next through the one door that isn't locked until a cutscene is triggered that advances the plot, and sometimes gives you a power-up. Because without new items to find in order to open up new paths forward, the only reason to explore is because the game tells you to. And frankly, that's just not Metroid. The entire structure of the series is based around Samus exploring a world to get strong enough to progress further. That whole first game doesn't even have a story, except in the manual. It uses the environmental storytelling of item collection to give you your paths forward. Starting her with all her items but no permission to use them takes all the player agency away and turns exploration into a waiting game, as you see barriers you could totally cross, but you're just not allowed to. And any actual pickups, such as energy tanks and missile expansions, are barely off your path, usually just in a small alcove behind a missile or bomb door, and exploration requires almost no critical thought. I mean, the one puzzle I mentioned in Sector 2 is barely defined as a morph ball puzzle. I only gave it a shout out because at least it tried. Barely. The entire structure of the game feels more akin to Devil May Cry, or probably more fitting in the context would be Team Ninja's own Ninja Gaiden. Those types of games similarly work in a 3D space with a lot of connecting corridors to larger spaces, usually with enemy gauntlets before you can proceed. And similarly, the only real reason to kill enemies is because the game forces you to for progression. Except, even in those cases, there's usually some kind of score multiplier or experience system to encourage you to fight so you can unlock new skills and stuff in the menu. Whereas applying that same structure to a Metroid game just means the enemies are a hindrance that never drop anything, so why bother outside of how cool combat can look sometimes? I will do a full breakdown of Metroid Fusion later in the proper Metroid retrospective, so I don't want to spend too long comparing them, but that game is structured much closer to the traditional Metroid formula, just with the occasional locked door for plot reasons that usually just entails stopping at the navigation room at the beginning of that next area before the whole thing is open up to you. Though you do still get the entire map laid out, except for the, hidden areas and stuff. And all Metroid games start out fairly linear, because you just don't have the moveset to get past most barriers. But Metroid Fusion actively connects multiple areas together later on, and has you specifically avoiding your orders and exploring off the beaten path because you don't trust the authority. In Other M, Samus would rather die in a fire than activate her protective gear without permission. And you don't get almost full exploration access until the post-game. And it's still tedious because there's only one way in and out of every sector, and they're not terribly interesting to explore in the first place, so looping around back to the entrance doesn't feel great, even when you have limited access back through them during the main game. Metroid Fusion, despite its linearity, also requires a lot more thoughtful exploration through each area to make progress. You might know what your end goal is, but it's not really a linear path to get anywhere, and some of it is almost too obtuse to get around. Where you see the map, but that's like the one place you can't go, so you have to find your exit into an unmapped portion, rather than just following the clearly set path of open doors in front of you in Other M. So yeah, I'm gonna stop before I can no longer claim this as brief. I'll just sum it all up to say this game preys on the nostalgia of old school Metroid fans, but then barely plays at all like a Metroid game, and actively slaps the player in the face with how dumbed down the formula is. So it's this baffling mix of things because it feels cater-made to only the most die-hard lore hounds that would know what any of this nostalgia is, but gets everything along the way so wrong that those die-hard enough to finish it would do so angrily out of spite. Like me, for example. It makes no sense. I've written like 45 pages on this stupid game, but I'm still at a loss on how to explain what it even thought it was doing. Especially since it had the godfather of Metroid on its creative team. This should have been his baby, not the baby. And every now and then, it has a clever idea that kind of works, but 9/10 is so bafflingly stupid that I don't get how any of this actually ended up being a game. I can't say I enjoyed playing it, even with the quality of life features I was able to use in the mod. Never would have managed on an actual Wii. But I'm also kinda glad I finally saw the whole thing through, so I could understand for myself how utterly wrong it all is. This game is wild, y'all. It's a Metroid game in title only, and I genuinely can't wait to talk about some real Metroid games for you next time. I also can't wait for Metroid Dread, but I feel like that kind of goes without saying at this point. Anyway, see you next mission. It is hot in here. I am damp. Look at my head. I need a powder. There's some makeup up in here. Where's my makeup artist? I also can't wait for Metroid Dread, but I feel like saying that goes without... What? I probably got super sweaty throughout the progress of that video. Alright. I'm gonna stop so I can turn the fan on. Yeah.